The sun filtered through the treetops, painting the forest with a vibrant green, but the beauty of the scenery was a mask for the darkness in a man's heart. The nephew, with a forced smile, pushed his aunt's wheelchair to an isolated spot under the pretense of a picnic. The elderly woman, frail and oblivious to the malice surrounding her, merely watched the leaves dance. With calculating coldness, the nephew scattered pieces of raw fish onto his aunt's lap, a macabre bait for the fate he wished upon her. "Nature will take care of it," he thought, as he retreated to hide in a nearby tree, chewing on his jerky, waiting for a beast's hunger to do the dirty work. But the forest, with its ancestral wisdom, had other plans. A brown bear, imposing and hungry, emerged from the shadows. Its eyes, however, did not fixate on the woman's fragility, but on the cruelty that surrounded her. With surprising delicacy for its size, the beast collected the fish, without even brushing against the elderly woman. And then, with a roar that made the earth tremble, the bear turned towards the tree where the villain was hiding, and with a powerful blow knocked it down, revealing the nephew's cowardice in broad daylight, delivering him to the implacable justice of the forest itself. The crash echoed through the forest, a thunder of wood and earth that tore through the silence. The tree, which until then had served as a lair for evil, collapsed with an agonizing groan, taking the nephew and his supposed safety with it. He fell awkwardly, a tangle of limbs and panic, the impact ripping a muffled scream and the air from his lungs. Broken branches lashed his skin, the damp earth and dry leaves partially cushioning the fall, but not the pain. An arm bent at an unnatural angle, and a sharp pang shot through his rib, making him gasp. The jerky, which moments before had been his comfort, flew from his hands, scattering across the ground like crumbs of his own depravity. Dust rose in a suffocating cloud, mixing with the smell of overturned earth and broken pine. When his vision cleared, what he saw froze the blood in his veins. The brown bear, a mountain of muscle and fur, stood there imposing just a few feet away. Its eyes, previously focused on cruelty, now seemed to burn with an intensity that went beyond hunger. It was a silent judgment, the personification of the forest's fury. The roar that brought down the tree still reverberated in his ears, but now the silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was the silence of the prey, of inevitability. The nephew tried to move, but the pain paralyzed him. His left arm hung limp, and every breath was an ordeal. Fear, a primal and overwhelming fear, seized every fiber of his being. He was no longer the calculating manipulator, but a cornered animal, at the mercy of a force he could never control. His eyes scoured the ground, desperately searching for something, anything, that could serve as a weapon or an escape route. There was nothing. The forest, once a silent accomplice to his plans, now rose against him. Meanwhile, a few feet away, his aunt remained in her wheelchair. The sound of the falling tree had startled her, her cloudy eyes widening slightly. She did not comprehend the extent of the scene, the malice behind the picnic, nor the fury that had erupted. To her, it was just another sound in the forest, a natural event, perhaps a distant storm. A slight confusion clouded her face, but there was no fear nor understanding of the betrayal that surrounded her. Her fragility protected her from the brutal truth, keeping her in a bubble of forced innocence, a stark contrast to the terror consuming her nephew. The bear took a slow, deliberate step, its enormous paws crushing dry branches with a crisp sound that seemed amplified in the tense silence. Every movement of the beast was a blow to the nephew's heart. He could smell the animal, earth, moss, and an untamed wildness. The bear did not advance with the haste of a hungry predator, but with the calculating calm of one delivering a lesson. Its eyes never left the nephew, fixed on him with an intensity that promised more than a simple meal. Then the beast stopped. its muzzle tilted, sniffing the air. The smell of jerky, which the nephew had been chewing with such pleasure in his hiding spot, now hung in the air. The bear lowered its head, not to attack the man, but to inspect the pieces of meat that had fallen from the villain's hand. With surprising precision, the same delicacy it had used to collect the fish from his aunt's lap, the bear began to pick up the pieces of jerky, one by one, with its lips, without even brushing against the nephew, who lay terrified at its feet. It was a humiliation, a cruel inversion of roles. The predator, who should have devoured him, was merely collecting the food that he, the predator of his own aunt, had dropped. The nephew watched, powerless, as the bear cleared the ground of his provisions. There was not a shred of compassion in the beast's eyes, only a majestic indifference. When the last piece of jerky was collected, the bear raised its head. Its eyes met the nephew's once more. There was no roar, no attack, just a long, penetrating gaze that seemed to tear the man's soul from him. It was a look that said, "You are exposed, you are alone, and the forest will remember." With a final slow step, the bear turned, the dark mass of its body disappearing as silently as it had appeared among the trees. Silence returned, but now it was a heavy silence laden with the echo of wild justice. The nephew lay there amidst the wreckage of the tree, his arm broken, his rib aching, his body trembling uncontrollably. The forest had not killed him, but it had stripped him bare, wounded him, and left him at the mercy of himself, with terror as his only companion. His aunt, oblivious to everything, merely watched the leaves dance, while the forest, in its ancestral wisdom, had delivered its verdict. The power game was over, and the villain had lost. The real battle, however, was just beginning. The nephew lay there, a heap of pain and shattered plans. The silence of the forest, once merely a backdrop, now seemed like a drum beating in his ears, broken only by his own gasps and the sharp ringing in his head. His left arm, now a dead weight, pulsed with a searing pain that radiated throughout his body, each heartbeat amplifying the torment. Every attempt to move was an ordeal. A silent scream lost in the vastness of the forest, unheard by anyone. The smell of damp earth and pine sap mingled with the metallic scent of his own cold sweat, a poignant reminder of his vulnerability, his insignificance before that imposing nature. He was exposed, not just physically, but in his petty soul, naked before the silent judgment of the trees. The terror, which the bear had planted with its penetrating gaze and brute force, now bloomed in his chest, not as a primal fear of being devoured, but as the dread of being alone, wounded, and helpless. It was the fear of insignificance, of irrelevance. The sun, which had previously filtered gently through the canopy, now seemed to mock him, casting elongated shadows that danced like ghosts in his blurred vision, announcing the end of the day. The forest, which he had hoped would be his silent accomplice, had become his executioner, leaving him at the mercy of his own mistakes, his own wickedness. His desperate eyes swept the scene, searching for an exit, a miracle. The wreckage of the tree lay scattered, a monument to his arrogance and his fall. His aunt's wheelchair, a few feet away, seemed like a point of light amidst the growing darkness, a patch of normalcy in his chaos. She was there, motionless, a fragile and oblivious figure, a burden he had planned to remove, but who now became a constant reminder of his failure. The confusion on her aged face was almost childlike, an innocence that irritated him even more. How could she be so calm, so unaware of the hell he was living, of the danger he had exposed her to? A groan escaped his cracked lips, a hoarse, pathetic sound. He tried to drag himself, but the pain in his rib was excruciating, each movement a knife thrust. Every muscle seemed to protest, every nerve screamed in agony. The ground was cold and damp, and the moisture began to penetrate his clothes, a chill that went beyond the skin. The temperature in the forest was already beginning to drop, a premonition of the approaching night, bringing with it other dangers, other sounds, other threats. The sounds of the forest, once distant and harmless, now became menacing, each one a herald of an unknown danger. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of dry branches, the distant call of a nocturnal bird, every noise seemed amplified, transformed into a whisper of imminent danger, a promise of eyes watching him from the shadows. He imagined smaller, but no less dangerous, predators, drawn by his immobility and the smell of blood that might emanate from his wounds. Rage began to bubble within him, mixing with fear, a toxic concoction that consumed him. Rage at the bear, rage at the forest, rage at his own incompetence for failing in his diabolical plan, and above all, rage at his aunt. She was the root of all his problems, the inheritance he coveted, the obstacle he could not overcome. Even now, in her fragility, she seemed to defy him with her mere existence, with her irritating serenity. He needed to move, needed to get out of there. But how? His broken arm prevented him from supporting himself. His rib prevented him from breathing deeply, from gathering strength. His mind, once so cunning and calculating, was now clouded by pain and panic, unable to formulate a coherent plan. He was trapped, an insect on its back, struggling uselessly with no hope of righting himself. Twilight advanced rapidly, painting the sky with shades of purple and orange that would soon give way to total blackness. The light diminished with each passing second, and with it the little hope he had left. The forest, which during the day was a stage of life, would transform into a labyrinth of shadows and unknown dangers at night. He had no flashlight, no shelter, not even a match. The jerky, his only provision, had been taken by the bear, a cruel irony that made him grind his teeth in frustration. The idea of spending the night there, wounded and unprotected, was more terrifying than any bear. The deepening cold, the darkness that swallowed the world, the nocturnal animals awakening. He was not a man of the forest. He was a man of the city, accustomed to the comfort and security of walls and ceilings. The wildness of the environment was overwhelming, and he felt increasingly smaller, more vulnerable. He tried to call for help, but his voice was a mere hoarse whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. No one would come. No one knew where he was. He had chosen that isolated spot precisely for this, so that no one could interfere with his plan, and now that same choice turned against him, trapping him in his own snare. His aunt, for her part, felt a cold breeze touch her wrinkled face. She raised her head slightly, her eyes fixed on a distant spot among the trees. To her, the sound of the falling tree had been merely an event of nature, and the silence that followed was the calm after the storm. She did not feel the urgency, the despair that consumed her nephew. Her mind, protected by the mists of age, interpreted the world in a softer, less threatening way. She merely watched the last lights of day fade, perhaps thinking of a warm tea or an old story, oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few feet from her. But for the nephew, there were no stories, only the harsh reality. He was alone, wounded, and night was falling. The true battle, the battle for survival, was just beginning. And he knew, with a cold certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the odds were against him. He had underestimated the forest, underestimated life, and now the forest was collecting its price. He needed a plan, and fast, before the darkness swallowed everything, including the little hope he had left. But with a broken body and a panicked mind, the only thing he could think of was the approaching pain and cold, and the shadow of the bear that still seemed to loom over him. Darkness descended upon the forest like a heavy shroud, not only stealing the light, but also the little hope that still clung to the nephew's soul. Every fiber of his being screamed in protest. His left arm, hanging unnaturally, was a searing burden, and his ribs, each time he tried to breathe deeper, sent waves of sharp pain that left him breathless. The cold, once merely a distant promise, now bit at his exposed skin, penetrating his damp clothes and chilling his bones. He felt an uncontrollable tremor run through his body, not just from fear, but from incipient hypothermia that threatened to paralyze him completely. The smell of the forest, which had once been fresh and invigorating, now became oppressive. The damp moss, the overturned earth, the sap from broken trees, everything mingled into a dense, suffocating aroma punctuated by the metallic bitter scent of his own blood and sweat. He lay there, a rag of a man, amidst the wreckage of his own arrogance, and the forest seemed to watch him, each shadow lengthening like an accusing finger. A hoarse groan escaped his throat, more a lament than an intentional sound. He tried to move his legs, but they felt heavy, inert. The pain was an insurmountable wall. His mind, once so sharp in its Machiavellian schemes, was now a whirlwind of panic and despair. He needed to get out of there, needed shelter, fire, anything that could ward off the darkness and cold that were engulfing him. His eyes, blurred and desperate, swept the ground in search of something, anything, a strong branch to use as support, a stone to break, a sign of life. But there was only the earth, the dry leaves and the pieces of wood from the fallen tree, silent witnesses to his failure. His aunt's wheelchair, a few feet away, seemed like a beacon amidst the growing darkness, a point of contrast that deeply irritated him. There she was, motionless, oblivious, wrapped in her own world of memories and dreams. The serenity on her aged face, even with occasional confusion, was an insult to his own agony. How could she be so calm, so unaware of the hell he was living, of the danger he had exposed her to, and which now turned against him? Rage, a cold and venomous fire, began to burn in his chest, mixing with fear and pain. It was the rage of impotence, of the injustice of his own situation. He had planned everything so meticulously, and now he lay there, broken, humiliated, while she, the source of all his problems, remained untouched. He needed to reach her, not to help her, but to use the wheelchair as a means of escape, or perhaps to drag her to a safer place, away from the imminent dangers of the night. The idea of abandoning her there, despite his wickedness, seemed even more perilous now that he was wounded and vulnerable. If he couldn't move himself, perhaps he could use the chair for support, to drag himself, to gain some mobility. It was a desperate plan, born of panic, but it was the only one his clouded mind could formulate. With a groan of effort, he tried to push himself up. His right arm, the only functional one, scraped the damp earth. But the weight of his body and the searing pain in his left arm and ribs prevented him. He fell back, his head gently hitting the ground, a flash of stars in his vision. Every movement was a torment, every breath an effort. Sweat streamed down his forehead, mixing with dirt and blood. He tried again, this time with more caution. He rolled onto his side, supporting himself on his right elbow, feeling his ribs protest with excruciating pain. With every inch he managed to drag himself, the forest seemed to mock him, the sounds of the night intensifying. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of dry branches, the distant hoot of owls. Everything seemed to draw closer, to become sharper, more menacing. He imagined eyes gleaming in the shadows, smaller, but no less dangerous. Predators, drawn by the smell of blood, by his immobility. The darkness was almost total now. The twilight had completely vanished, and the still shy stars barely pierced the dense tree canopy. He was blind, or nearly so. His aunt's wheelchair was just an indistinct silhouette, a distant and unattainable goal. The cold deepened, and he felt his muscles stiffen, his skin prickling. "Aunt, Aunt." He tried to call, but his voice was a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible. He didn't know if he was calling for help, for attention, or just to break the oppressive silence that surrounded him. His aunt, however, did not respond. She was there, a point of stillness amidst his chaos, perhaps already asleep or lost in thoughts he could never comprehend. Rage bubbled up again. She wouldn't help him. She would never help him. He was alone, completely alone. The forest had collected its price, and he was the currency. He continued to drag himself, inch by inch, pain radiating throughout his body. The ground was freezing, and the dampness penetrated his clothes, intensifying the chill. He felt with each drag that he was expending the last reserves of his energy. But the idea of lying there, waiting for whatever the night might bring, was even more terrifying. The smell of earth and wet leaves intensified, and he could have sworn he heard the sound of small animals scurrying nearby. It wasn't the bear, he knew, but the forest was alive, and he was a wounded intruder, easy prey. He needed the chair, needed it to move, to protect himself, to perhaps, just perhaps, get out of that hell before the night consumed him completely. With each drag, the image of the bear returned to his mind, those eyes without compassion, that majestic indifference. The animal had stolen his food, knocked down his tree, broken his body and his dignity. And now the forest, the beast's silent accomplice, was finishing the job. He was a few feet from the chair, but it seemed an insurmountable distance. The darkness was almost absolute, and the cold became unbearable. He felt exhaustion take over his body, his consciousness beginning to waver. But the image of his aunt, sitting there, oblivious, was a last surge of rage and despair. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let her win, even if it was just for his own survival. With one last agonizing effort, he stretched out his right arm, trying to reach the wheelchair's wheel. His fingers brushed the cold metal, an electric contact that spurred him on. But at that exact moment, a different sound, closer, more guttural, cut through the night's silence. It wasn't the rustling of leaves, nor the hoot of an owl. It was a low growl coming from somewhere very, very close. The nephew froze, his body paralyzed not only by pain and cold, but by a primal terror that made him hold his breath. The bear had returned, or perhaps something even worse. Night had fallen, and with it, the true hunt. The growl was not a distant echo. It vibrated through the very ground. Through his broken bones, a low, guttural murmur that spoke of immense power and predatory intent. Every emaciated muscle of the nephew contracted, not in a movement of flight, but in a spasm of pure terror. He couldn't breathe. The air seemed to have been sucked from his lungs, leaving him in a vacuum of panic. His eyes, already accustomed to the gloom, tried to pierce the darkness, but it was like staring into a bottomless abyss. There were only dancing shadows, indistinct shapes that seemed to writhe and draw closer. Then, the smell. Yes, the smell. It wasn't just moss and wet earth now. It was a strong animal odor, a mixture of wild forest and something denser, more menacing. The smell of wet fur, of earth, and of a primal ferocity that chilled the blood in his veins. He knew it. It was the bear's scent. The beast had returned. A chill, more intense than hypothermia, ran through his body. He lay on the ground, a piece of wounded flesh, and the predator was there, a few feet away, perhaps even closer than he dared imagine. His arm, outstretched towards his aunt's chair, now seemed like an offering, a lure. He tried to retract it, but his muscles were paralyzed by fear. The pain in his ribs and his left arm was constant, but now it was muffled by overwhelming terror. He heard a heavier rustle, the sound of large, heavy paws breaking dry branches. It wasn't a stealthy sound. It was a deliberate, confident sound of an animal that knew it was the king of that domain. The bear wasn't hiding. It was approaching. "No, please," he murmured, his voice so weak he could barely hear it. It was a useless plea, a last remnant of hope dissolving in the cold night air. His aunt, still sitting in her wheelchair, seemed like a statue. Her head was slightly tilted, and he could have sworn her eyes were closed. Was she sleeping, or just lost in her own fog, oblivious to the approaching death? The rage that had once driven him was now a luxury he couldn't afford. There was no time for rage, only for fear. He needed to move, needed to get out of there. But how? His body was a prison of pain and inertia. He tried to drag himself again, using his right elbow to push, but with each movement, a sharp pang in his ribs made him stop, gasping. The ground was cold and damp, and dirt clung to his sweaty skin. He felt an uncontrollable tremor, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline pumping through his veins, a poison that left him even more exhausted. The growl came again, closer this time, and he felt the air move, a heavy animal air. He could feel the beast's presence, even without seeing it clearly. It was as if the darkness had taken form, an invisible monster moving with lethal grace. His eyes tried to adjust, but the forest was a labyrinth of shadows. Suddenly, an immense shadow materialized right in front of him. It was no illusion. It was the bear. The massive silhouette, the dark fur blending with the night, the eyes that, even in the dark, seemed to reflect a cold, indifferent light. The beast was there just a few steps from him, so close he could feel the warmth of its body, its heavy, damp breath. The bear didn't seem aggressive, not immediately. It just watched with a cold, calculating curiosity. Its muzzle moved, sniffing the air, and the nephew knew that the scent of his blood, of his wounded flesh, was what had drawn it back. He was the bait now, not the fish. A chilling panic seized him. He was at the mercy of that monster. He tried to scream, but his throat was dry, and only a wheeze escaped. The bear tilted its head slightly, as if listening to the inaudible sound, assessing its prey. The nephew closed his eyes, awaiting the impact, the claws, the teeth. He imagined himself being torn apart, his flesh ripped, his bones broken. The image was vivid, terrible, but nothing happened. He opened his eyes slowly. The bear was still there, motionless, watching him. Then, to his horror and confusion, the beast moved, not towards him, but towards his aunt's wheelchair. The nephew watched, paralyzed, as the bear approached the elderly woman who still seemed asleep. The nephew's heart pounded erratically, a frantic drum in his chest. What would the bear do? Would it attack her? Would it take her? The beast extended an enormous paw with claws like daggers, but did so with surprising delicacy. It did not touch his aunt. Instead, the bear sniffed the air around her, and then, with a swift, precise movement, picked something up from the ground near the chair. It was the rest of the jerky the nephew had dropped when the tree collapsed. The bear picked it up with its teeth without even brushing against his aunt's clothes and stepped back. The nephew watched, incredulous. The bear was there for food, not for gratuitous violence, and somehow it seemed to have a strange reverence for his aunt, or perhaps just an indifference that extended to her, but not to him. The beast chewed the jerky, the sound of its teeth grinding the food echoing in the night silence, a sound the nephew would never forget. As the bear ate, its eyes fixed on the nephew again. There was no anger, no fury, just a kind of cold recognition, as if to say, "You are the intruder, I am the owner." The nephew felt a profound humiliation mixed with terror. He had been defeated, not by a cunning plan, but by the pure and simple force of nature and by the indifference of a beast that saw him as nothing more than an obstacle, or perhaps a future meal. The bear finished the jerky, licked its chops, and with one last penetrating look at the nephew, turned and began to move away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The rustle of its paws grew more distant until the oppressive silence reigned once more. The nephew lay there on the cold ground, trembling uncontrollably. Adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but now it was mixed with profound despair. The bear was gone, but the night was not. And he was more wounded, more exhausted, and more alone than ever. His aunt, for her part, let out a soft sigh, perhaps in her sleep, or perhaps just a reflection of the night breeze. She was safe, untouched. And he, the architect of his own misfortune, was broken, on the verge of death. The irony was cruel. He had tried to use the forest and its creatures to get rid of his aunt, and now the forest had claimed him. The bear, whom he had tried to manipulate, had acted with a strange morality, sparing the innocent and punishing the guilty. But the punishment was not yet over. The night was long, and he knew the forest held many other predators, many other dangers, and without the protection of light, without hope of help, he was just a piece of wounded flesh, awaiting the next turn of the hunt. He needed to move, needed to find shelter. But strength abandoned him, and the darkness seemed to close in, promising a cold and solitary end. The battle for survival had just gained a new and more terrifying chapter. The silence that followed the bear's departure was more terrifying than any growl. It was a heavy vacuum, filled only by the frantic rhythm of the nephew's heart and the deafening hum of despair. He lay there, a rag of flesh and broken bones, abandoned by the beast he himself had summoned. The irony was a poison more potent than any insect bite, corroding his already fragile soul. The forest monster, a predator without conscience, had demonstrated a strange form of justice, sparing the innocent victim and leaving the tormentor to his own fate. The night's cold intensified, penetrating his torn clothes, his exposed bones. Every breath was an agony, every heartbeat a reminder of his fragile existence. He tried to move his fingers, but the pain in his left arm was excruciating, an ice spear piercing his shoulder. His ribs, he knew, were broken, perhaps puncturing a vital organ. He tasted the metallic tang of blood in his mouth, mixed with earth and humiliation. The image of his aunt, untouched, serene in her wheelchair, was a visual torment. She slept, or was in some state of stupor that isolated her from the brutal reality surrounding him. How was it possible? How could she remain so oblivious, so immune, while he slowly disintegrated on the cold forest floor? The rage that had once moved him was now a luxury he could no longer sustain. There was only fear, pure and primitive, and the overwhelming awareness of his own insignificance. He needed to move. The voice in his head, weak and desperate, repeated the command. Hypothermia was a silent enemy, more insidious than the bear. But how? His body was a dead weight, a prison of pain. He tried to drag himself, using his right elbow as an oar, scraping his already wounded skin on the damp soil. Every inch was a battle, every movement a muffled scream. Dirt and dry leaves clung to his sweaty face, to his tangled hair. He felt an uncontrollable tremor, the cold seeping into every cell, stealing his vital warmth. The darkness of the forest was a living entity, pulsating with sounds he had once ignored. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, the distant croak of a frog. Everything transformed into threats, into whispers of invisible predators. The bear was gone, but the forest was a cauldron of life and death, and he was just another wounded prey, awaiting the next hunter. He tried to lift his head, searching for a point of reference, a sliver of light. But there was only the dense canopy of trees, an impenetrable ceiling that hid the stars. A new scent, more subtle than the bear's, but equally disturbing, reached his nostrils. It was the smell of decomposition, of rotting flesh, mixed with odors of moss and wet earth. The smell of the forest itself, in its rawest, most indifferent form. He felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't the bear. It was something different, something moving in the shadows, watching. He closed his eyes for an instant, seeking refuge in the internal darkness, but the images of his own helplessness and his aunt's indifference haunted him. He had planned everything, every detail, to get rid of her, to inherit her fortune. And now he lay there, on the verge of death, while she remained untouched, perhaps even smiling in her sleep. Bitterness was a sour taste in his mouth, stronger than blood. With superhuman effort, he managed to turn onto his stomach, supporting himself on his elbow. His eyes swept the darkness, trying to discern shapes, movements. The forest seemed to breathe, each shadow lengthening and shrinking with the wind. He heard a sound, a soft dragging coming from behind his aunt's wheelchair. It wasn't the bear, it was smaller, more stealthy. A different predator, perhaps. Panic seized him again, an icy knot in his stomach. He was trapped, immobilized, an easy meal. He tried to scream, but his voice was just a hoarse whisper, lost in the vast silence of the night. His aunt, a few feet away, remained motionless, a ghostly figure who seemed to mock his suffering. The sound repeated closer, a rustle of dry leaves, a snap of a branch. He could feel the presence, the breathing. His eyes widened, trying to pierce the darkness, but it was useless. The forest swallowed him, transforming him into part of its cycle of life and death. He was the prey, and the hunt, he knew, was just beginning. The night was long, and he was just a piece of wounded flesh, awaiting the next turn of wild nature. Despair deepened, promising a cold and solitary end, very different from the one he had planned for his aunt. He was at the mercy of the forest, and the forest had no pity. The smell. That's what hit him first, stronger now that the bear was gone, and the air, previously heavy with the beast's breath, felt thinner, sharper. It wasn't the earthy, powerful scent of the bear, but something more acute, wilder. An odor of wet fur turned earth and unmistakably blood. His own blood, slowly seeping into the cold ground, mixing with the dampness and moss. He lay on his stomach, his face pressed to the earth, the taste of dirt and iron in his mouth. Every fiber of his body screamed in protest. His left arm, crushed under the weight of the tree, was a constant, throbbing pain that radiated through his shoulder and chest. His ribs, he was sure, were broken, each breath an excruciating effort that threatened to tear his lungs. The night's cold deepened, an icy embrace that promised to steal his vital warmth, cell by cell. But the cold wasn't the worst. The worst was the sound, the soft dragging he had heard before, coming from behind his aunt. Now repeated, closer, more defined. It wasn't a heavy sound like the bear's, but a quick rustle, a brushing of bushes, followed by a dry snap of a branch. And then a more disturbing sound. A low, guttural sniff, which seemed to come from several directions at once. His eyes, wide in the darkness, tried in vain to discern something. The forest was an impenetrable mass of shadows, where every tree, every bush, seemed to writhe and take on menacing forms. He tried to turn his head, but the pain in his neck was searing. With a desperate effort, he managed to move his eyes, scanning the perimeter, searching for a sliver of light. A sign, anything that could identify what was lurking. And then he saw not one but two flickering lights in the darkness, low to the ground, shining with a sinister intensity. Eyes that watched him, motionless, assessing. They were smaller than the bear's, closer, and there was a gleam of predatory intelligence in them, a hunger that seemed more calculating, more patient. A low growl, almost a lament, echoed from the shadows, followed by another and another. It wasn't a growl of fury, but of expectation, as if they knew he was wounded, that he was easy prey. A pack. The realization hit him like lightning, chilling the blood in his veins. Wolves, coyotes. It didn't matter. They were predators, and he was the meal. The irony was a poison that burned his throat. He, the architect of so much evil, now lay defenseless, at the mercy of the same wild nature he had tried to use. His aunt, a few feet away, remained untouched, a serene silhouette in her wheelchair, oblivious to the terror consuming him. She seemed asleep, or perhaps was in a stupor so deep that not even the smell of blood and the presence of predators awakened her. How was it possible that she remained so immune while he slowly disintegrated? The sniffing grew more intense, closer. He could hear the dragging of paws on the leaf-covered ground, the rustling of bushes parting. The smell of wild animal was overwhelming now, mixed with the odor of damp earth and decomposition. He tried to scream, but his voice was just a hoarse wheeze, an inaudible plea lost in the oppressive silence of the forest. The gleaming eyes multiplied. 3, 4, perhaps 5 pairs of eyes watched him from the darkness. They moved in a slow semicircle, tightening the noose. He felt panic rise in his throat, an icy knot that prevented him from breathing. He was a piece of wounded flesh, an easy feast for those hungry eyes. One of them, the boldest, partially emerged from the shadows. It was a coyote, lean and cunning, with matted fur and eyes that gleamed with an ancestral hunger. It sniffed the air, head low, muscles tense. Others followed, slender, stealthy figures moving with deadly grace. They were not in a hurry. They knew he couldn't escape. The alpha coyote approached one step, then another. He could hear the sound of paws on the ground, the rustling of leaves. The animal stopped a few feet away, head tilted, eyes fixed on him. There was no anger, just a cold curiosity, an assessment of the prey. He could see the sharp teeth, the damp muzzle, the pointed ears that twitched, catching every sound. He tried to drag himself, to move an arm, anything to show he was still alive, that he wasn't a carcass. But his body refused to obey, a prison of pain and paralysis. The pain in his left arm was excruciating, a sharp pang that made him see stars. He was trapped, immobilized, an easy meal. The coyote took another step and then another until it was just an arm's length away. The animal's warm, wild breath hit his face, a smell of raw meat and earth. He could feel the warmth of the coyote's body, the tension in its muscles. The other coyotes remained in the shadows, watching, waiting for the leader's signal. His eyes met the coyote's. There was no pity, only the relentless hunger of nature. The animal lowered its head, sniffing the air around him, its muzzle brushing his tangled hair. He felt an uncontrollable tremor run through his body. This was the end. Not the end he had planned for his aunt, but a far crueler and lonelier end. The forest had claimed him, not as a king, but as prey. The coyote opened its mouth, revealing sharp teeth, and a low growl, almost a purr of satisfaction, escaped its throat. It was about to bite. The nephew closed his eyes, awaiting the impact, the pain, the tearing of his flesh. The hunt was over, and he was the prey. The coyote's growl sent a shiver down his spine, a primal sound that promised the end. The animal's warm, fetid breath brushed his face, and the nephew, eyes closed, awaited the tearing of flesh, the final pain that would free him from his torment. But the impact didn't come. Instead, he felt a slight, almost delicate tug, and a sound of rapid, voracious chewing. He opened his eyes, blinking in the darkness, and what he saw shocked him. The coyote hadn't bitten him. Instead, the animal had sniffed out something that had fallen from his torn pocket when the tree hit him. A piece of jerky, the same he had been chewing moments before his world collapsed, lay on the ground, inches from his face. The coyote, with surprising agility, had snatched the piece of jerky, chewing it with animalistic pleasure. The other coyotes, previously motionless in the shadows, now stirred, drawn by the scent of the processed meat, more intense and inviting than the fresh blood that seeped from the nephew's body. A low growl, almost a lament of frustration, escaped the alpha coyote's throat. It had been the first to find the treasure, and now the others approached, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of covetousness and hunger. The nephew watched, paralyzed, as the pack focused on the small piece of jerky. It was a momentary reprieve, a pause in the death sentence, but also a new form of terror. He wasn't the main course, not yet. He was just the entree, waiting for the appetizers to be devoured. The pain in his left arm was a constant, an excruciating pang that pulsed in sync with his racing heart. His ribs, he was sure, were crushed, and every breath was an ordeal. The night's cold deepened, and he felt the warmth drain from his body, replaced by a glacial numbness that threatened to consume his consciousness. But his mind, despite everything, remained cruelly lucid, registering every detail of his private hell. He watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The coyotes, previously focused on him, now vied for the small piece of jerky. The leader snarled, defending its possession, while the others circled, trying to steal a morsel. It was a wild dance, a display of hierarchy and instinct, and he, the architect of his own misfortune, was the main spectator. Irony was a poison that burned his throat. He had used nature to try to get rid of his aunt, and now nature was using him as a toy, a wounded piece of flesh to be tormented before the final slaughter. His aunt, a few feet away, remained a statue of indifference. Her silhouette in the wheelchair was a silent mockery, proof of his own spectacular failure. He hated her with renewed intensity, a hatred that surpassed physical pain. How could she be so calm, so oblivious, while he slowly disintegrated? Was she faking it? Was she, in some perverse way, aware of his suffering and delighting in it? The idea was an even greater torment than the coyotes. The piece of jerky was quickly consumed. The alpha coyote licked its chops, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. The others, frustrated, turned their attention back to the original source of the scent, the nephew. The momentary reprieve dissolved, replaced by renewed and even more intense terror. Now, there were no distractions. He was the only meal available. The coyotes began to move again, a slow, deliberate semicircle, tightening the noose. Their steps were almost silent on the leaf-covered ground, but the rustling of bushes and the low, guttural sniffs were audible, each sound a hammer beating in his chest. He could smell them, a mixture of wet fur, earth, and a metallic odor of blood, perhaps his own, perhaps from some previous prey. He tried to move, to drag himself, anything to show he was still a threat, that he wasn't a carcass. But his body refused to obey. His left arm was numb, a useless mass of flesh and bone. His legs, trapped under the weight of the tree, were just dead weight. He was trapped, immobilized, an easy meal. The alpha coyote, the same one that had taken the jerky, stepped forward. Its eyes, previously focused on the dried meat, were now fixed on the nephew, with a hunger that seemed deeper, more ancestral. It lowered its head, sniffing the air, and the nephew felt the animal's warm, damp breath on his face again. This time, there was no distraction. A low growl, almost a hiss, escaped the coyote's throat. It wasn't a growl of fury, but of possession, of dominance. The animal drew even closer, its muzzle brushing the nephew's tangled hair. He could feel the rough texture of the coyote's fur, the contained strength in its muscles. The other coyotes in the shadows watched, awaiting the signal. The nephew closed his eyes again, but the images of his aunt, serene and untouched, and the hungry coyotes mingled in his mind. He had failed, miserably. And now, the forest, the same forest he thought he could dominate, was collecting its price, a price he never imagined he would have to pay. The coyote opened its mouth, revealing sharp teeth, and the nephew felt his body tremble. He expected the pain, the tearing, the end, but again, the impact didn't come. Instead, a sound, a different sound, not a coyote's snarl, but a loud crack, followed by a violent rustling of leaves and branches. And then a scream, a human scream, sharp and terrified, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. The coyotes, previously focused on the nephew, froze. Their ears twitched, catching the sound. The leader raised its head, its eyes gleaming with a new curiosity, a new priority. The scent of human fear, fresh and intense, seemed to have replaced the smell of the nephew's wounded flesh. The pack, as one turned and vanished into the shadows, moving with surprising speed towards the sound of the scream. The nephew lay there on the cold ground, his heart pounding erratically. He was alone again, But the terror had not diminished. The forest had sent a new threat, or perhaps by a perverse miracle, a distraction. But who had screamed, and why? He didn't know if the coyote's flight was a blessing or just a postponement of his own death. The night was long, and the forest, he knew, still had many horrors to reveal. He was at its mercy, a mere pawn in its cruel and indifferent game. The smell of blood, now mixed with the scent of human fear, hung in the air, a promise of more violence, more suffering, and he, trapped in his private hell, could only wait. The silence that followed the coyote's departure brought no relief, only a new layer of terror. It was a heavy silence, filled by the buzzing of blood in his ears and the erratic rhythm of his own heart. The cold night air of the forest seemed to cut his exposed skin, penetrating his torn clothes and aching bones. Every breath was an effort, a sharp reminder of his crushed ribs, the searing pain in his left arm, now a numb and useless mass. He was alone again, but solitude was a prison, not a liberation. The question hammered in his mind, more insistent than the physical pain. Who had screamed, and why? The sound still echoed in his ears, a sharp lament of pure human dread. It wasn't the cry of a wounded animal, but the unmistakable sound of a soul in agony. The forest, which had once seemed merely indifferent, now revealed itself as a stage for more complex, more human horrors. Was it another camper? A careless adventurer like himself, perhaps? Or something more sinister, something the forest guarded in its depths? He tried to move his head, a Herculean effort that sent waves of pain through his spine. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, swept the dancing shadows, searching for any sign, any clue. But the darkness was an impenetrable veil, and the trees, once his silent accomplices, now seemed impassive observers, guarding their secrets with an ancient cruelty. The smell of blood, his own and the coyote's, now mingled with a new odor, a scent of human fear, fresh and intense, that seemed to permeate the very air. His aunt. His eyes turned to the motionless silhouette a few feet away. She remained there, a statue of indifference in her wheelchair, her head slightly tilted, as if listening to something he couldn't. Or perhaps, he thought with a chill of renewed hatred, she was merely enjoying the spectacle. The idea was a poison, corroding his already fragile mind. How could she be so calm, so oblivious, while he slowly disintegrated on the verge of death? Was she faking it? Was she, in some perverse way, aware of his suffering and delighting in it? The possibility was an even greater torment than the hungry coyotes. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry and rough. A hoarse sound, almost a moan, escaped his cracked lips. "Aunt?" The word was a faint whisper, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. There was no response. The figure in the wheelchair remained motionless, a silent mockery of his own spectacular failure. Hatred bubbled within him, an impotent fury that consumed him. He hated her for her resilience, for her apparent invulnerability, for having survived his diabolical plan. And above all, he hated her for his own weakness, for having been overcome by the forest he thought he could dominate. The cold intensified, and he felt the warmth drain from his body, replaced by a glacial numbness that threatened to consume his consciousness. He knew time was running out. If he didn't die from hemorrhage or his wounds, the cold would take him. Death, which he had so meticulously planned for his aunt, now stalked him in every shadow, in every icy breath of wind. And it wouldn't be a quick death, but a slow and agonizing dissolution, abandoned and alone. His thoughts began to mingle, fragments of memories and fears intertwining into a lucid nightmare. He saw his aunt's face, not the serene face of now, but the face from years ago, when she still walked, when she still smiled. He saw the sparkle in her eyes when she told him stories, the warmth of her hands when she hugged him. And then, the images distorted, smiles turned into sneers, hugs into chains. His mind, already on the verge of madness, was turning against him, punishing him with visions of a past he had tried to erase. A rustling of leaves, more distant this time, caught his attention. It wasn't the sound of coyotes. It was heavier, more deliberate. Something was moving in the forest, something large. The human scream had been a distraction, yes, but for whom? For the coyotes, or for the creature that had emitted it? And what had attracted this creature? The smell of blood? The smell of fear? Or perhaps the irony struck him with brutal force, the smell of raw fish he had scattered on his aunt's lap, still lingering in the air. He tried to scream, to call for help, but only a faint wheeze escaped his throat. Pain was a veil, paralysis a chain. He was trapped, a cornered animal, awaiting the final blow. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't be the coyotes. It would be something more, something the forest had saved for him, the architect of his own misfortune. The rustling drew closer, slow and constant. He could feel the vibrations in the ground, faint but unmistakable. His eyes, wide in the darkness, tried to pierce the veil of shadows. There was no anger in the coyote's eyes, only hunger. But what would come now? What had screamed? And what had drawn it to this place? His aunt's silhouette remained motionless, an enigmatic figure against the darkness. He hated her, yes, but in that moment of abject despair, a part of his being, a part he thought he had long eradicated, wished she were there for him, wished she could somehow save him. But she wasn't. She was just a reminder of his failure, a monument to his cruelty. The sound of breaking branches grew clearer, closer. It wasn't a small animal. It was something heavy, something that didn't care about making noise. The smell of damp earth and something else, something wild and untamed, filled the air. He closed his eyes again, panic rising in his throat. Whatever it was coming. And this time he knew there would be no distraction, no jerky to divert attention. He was the meal. The forest was collecting its final price, and he, the cruel nephew, would be consumed by it piece by piece until nothing remained but the echo of his own scream. The night was an abyss of horrors, and he was falling without hope of redemption. The sound became a heavy dragging, a brushing of fur against tree bark, and then a familiar sound, a low, deep growl that chilled his blood. It wasn't the sharp snarl of a coyote. It was the grave, powerful growl of a bear, the same bear. It had returned, and this time there was no raw fish to divert its attention. The irony was a final blow, more devastating than any physical pain. He had lured the bear to his aunt, and now the bear had returned for him. The circle was closing, and he was at its center, the final prey. The deep growl, that sound, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the lament of a coyote, nor the rustling of a smaller animal. It was the sound of the forest personified, the voice of death he had invoked. The bear, it had returned. The irony was a poison more potent than any physical pain, corroding him from within. I, the architect of so much cruelty, was now the prey. The circle was closing, and I was at its center, the final meal. My eyes, wide in the darkness, tried in vain to pierce the veil of shadows. The smell. The smell. Damp earth, pine, and unmistakably, the wild, powerful odor of the bear. It was close. I could feel the ground vibrate beneath my torn body, each throb a reminder of its mass, its untamed strength. The cold air seemed to thicken, heavy with expectation, with the dread emanating from every pore of my being. My crushed ribs protested with every shallow breath. My left arm, now a numb and useless mass, hung grotesquely. I was immobilized, a ready sacrifice, laid out on the cold altar of the forest. Pain was a veil, but consciousness cruelly remained. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could barely breathe. My throat was dry, scratched by futile attempts to emit any sound that wasn't a hoarse groan. The sound of breaking branches grew clearer, closer. Each snap was a hammer striking my skull, announcing the end. I could almost feel the beast's warm, heavy breath on my face. What would it do? Would it be quick? Or would the forest, in its perverse vengeance, prolong my agony, allowing the bear to toy with its prey before delivering the final blow? My eyes darted for an instant to the motionless silhouette of my aunt. She was still there, a few feet away, a statue of indifference in her wheelchair. How could she be so calm, so oblivious, or was it that she somehow was aware, enjoying the spectacle of my misfortune? The idea was an even greater torment than the approaching bear. I hated her resilience, her apparent invulnerability, hated her for having survived my diabolical plan, and above all, I hated my own weakness, my incompetence, for having been overcome by the forest I thought I could dominate. A louder growl, closer, reverberated through the air. It wasn't a growl of anger, but of hunger, a deep, ancestral hunger that I had awakened. The bear was now visible, a dark, imposing mass, moving with surprising grace for its size. Its eyes, I could see them now, two bright points in the darkness, reflecting the faint moonlight. There was no hatred in them, only nature's brutal indifference. I was just food. It stopped a few steps from me. The large, furry head moved from side to side, sniffing the air. I could feel the warmth of its body, the strong, earthy scent. My heart pounded erratically against my broken ribs, a drum of panic echoing in my ears. I closed my eyes, awaiting the impact, the tearing, the end, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt a warm, damp breath on my face. I opened my eyes again, and the bear's muzzle was inches from mine. Its whiskers brushed my skin, and I could see the dampness in its nostrils, the gleam of its teeth. It was sniffing me, assessing. Panic rose in my throat, a silent scream that would never find a voice. It recoiled slightly, and then to my surprise its head turned, not to me but to my aunt. I followed its gaze, confused, terrified. The bear, the same bear that had carefully picked the raw fish from her lap without touching her, now watched her. For an instant, time seemed to stop. What was it doing? Did it remember? Did it see her as a threat, or as something more? The bear let out a low grunt, almost a murmur, and took a step towards the wheelchair. It wasn't an aggressive step, but a measured one. My aunt remained motionless, a sphinx in the darkness. I wanted to scream, to warn her, but my voice was trapped. I wanted it to take her, not me. That thought, so vile, so desperate, hit me with the force of a punch. I, who had condemned her, now wished she would be the bait again. But the bear did not approach her. Instead, it turned its gaze back to me. And then it did something that chilled me to the soul. It leaned down, not to attack, but to sniff my left arm, the wounded arm, where blood still slowly seeped. Its muzzle touched my exposed skin, and I felt the dampness of its cold nose. There was no aggression, just a morbid curiosity, a silent assessment. It was toying with me. I was a toy, a meal it was savoring before consuming. The terror was absolute, paralyzing. I wasn't just prey, I was a lesson. The forest, in its perverse vengeance, was showing me how insignificant I was, how easily I could be erased. The bear raised its head again, and its eyes fixed on mine. There was no anger, not even intense hunger, only a deep and ancient indifference. And then it opened its mouth, not in a growl, but in a slow, deliberate yawn, revealing enormous, sharp teeth. The warm, sweet breath of meat and earth filled the space between us. I closed my eyes, awaiting the end, the impact, the tearing. But again, it didn't come. Instead, I felt a movement, not over me, but beside me. The bear moved, and the sound of its heavy paws on the ground was loud, clear. Was it moving away, or was it just repositioning itself? I opened my eyes, and the bear's silhouette was moving away, but not into the forest. It was moving in a semicircle, still watching me, but also looking at my aunt. And then it stopped, not far from the wheelchair, but not too close either. It sat down, a mountain of fur and muscle, watching me and watching her. What did this mean? It wasn't going to kill me? Not now. Was it guarding me, or was it waiting for something more? The tension was unbearable, more excruciating than the physical pain. I was at its mercy, a prisoner of its whim. The night was still long, and the forest, I knew, still had many horrors to reveal. And the bear, my bear, was just the beginning. It was giving me time. Time to think, time to suffer, time to understand the final price. The night dragged on, each second an eternity of pain and dread. The bear, that mountain of fur and muscle, remained seated, watching. Its eyes, two bright points in the darkness, were like beacons of a silent judgment, fixed on me, then on my aunt, then on me again. There was no haste in its movements, no fury in its gaze, only an ancestral patience, an indifference that was more terrifying than any growl. I was the prey, yes, but not common prey. I was a spectacle. The pain in my crushed ribs was a constant fire, and my useless arm pulsed with a dull agony. The forest's cold penetrated my bones, and the smell of damp earth and the bear itself enveloped me, suffocating. I was immobilized, an insect caught in a web, waiting for the giant arachnid to decide when and how to consume me. My mind, once so cunning in its cruel plans, was now a whirlwind of panic and despair. What did it want? Why didn't it just end it? With each shallow breath, the cold air scratched my throat, and I could feel the dried blood on my lips. My eyes, wide, tried to find some logic in the scene. The bear wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't attacking me. It was watching me, and my aunt, her silhouette in the wheelchair, remained as motionless as a rock. Not a tremor, not a sound. It was as if she wasn't there, or worse, as if she were part of it all. The idea hit me like lightning. What if she was aware? What if she was enjoying my agony, my humiliation? The image of her sitting there impassive while I was tortured by the forest and its most imposing creature was a torment that rivaled physical pain. I hated her for her resilience, for her survival, for her apparent connection to this wild place that was now devouring me. The bear let out a low grunt, almost a sigh, and slowly moved its head as if pondering. Its eyes fixed on me again, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, an assessment that went beyond hunger. It was as if it were reading my soul, exposing every act of cruelty, every vile thought. I was an open book to the forest, and the bear was its most attentive reader. The silence was broken only by the nocturnal sounds of the forest, the distant rustling of leaves, the melancholic hoot of an owl, the buzzing of invisible insects. Every sound seemed amplified, transformed into a reminder of my insignificance, my complete vulnerability. I had come to this forest to dominate, to control, to eliminate, and now the forest dominated me, controlled me, and was about to eliminate me. The bear stood up. Not suddenly, but with a deliberate slowness that made my heart leap. It did not move towards me nor towards my aunt. Instead, it began to walk in a slow, wide circle around both of us. Each step was heavy, yet silent, its enormous paws barely making a sound on the soft forest floor. It was a moving shadow, an imposing presence that surrounded me, cornering me without even touching me. My eyes followed every movement, panic growing in my chest. What was it doing? Was it a ritual, a dance of death? I could feel the air thicken, the tension becoming almost palpable. It was testing me, slowly breaking me piece by piece before delivering the final blow. The forest was teaching me a lesson, and the bear was the most relentless teacher. It completed the circle, stopping exactly where it had begun, a few feet from me. Its eyes, once again, fixed on mine. And then it made a subtle movement with its head, a slight nod towards my aunt. I followed its gaze, confused. What did it want me to see? My aunt. She was still there, a static figure. But for an instant, I swear I saw a gleam in her eyes, a reflection of the faint moonlight. Was it a gleam of understanding, of satisfaction? The idea disgusted and terrified me. She was watching, she was aware, and perhaps, just perhaps, she had been waiting for this. The bear let out a low growl, almost inaudible, but one that reverberated in my bones. It wasn't a growl of threat, but of instruction. As if it were telling me something, showing me something that I, in my blindness and cruelty, had failed to see. It wasn't just punishing me. It was forcing me to bear witness. It leaned down again, and I flinched, expecting the attack. But it didn't attack. Instead, it sniffed the ground near me, where the blood from my arm had dripped. It didn't lick, didn't bite. It just sniffed with an intensity that seemed to unravel the entire history of my violence, my failure. The bear raised its head again, and its eyes fixed on mine with renewed intensity. There was no anger, not even intense hunger, only a deep and ancient indifference. But now there was something more, an expectation, as if it were waiting for something, for a reaction, for a confession, for a recognition. Time stretched, each beat of my heart a drum of agony. I was naked before the forest, before the bear, before my aunt, my crimes, my fears, my insignificance, all exposed. The bear didn't need to tear me apart to destroy me. It was dismantling me from within, piece by piece, with the force of its silent presence and its penetrating gaze. The night was still young, and the forest, I knew, still held many horrors to reveal. And the bear, my bear, was just the beginning. It was giving me time, time to think, time to suffer, time to understand the final price. And I, the cruel nephew, was beginning to understand that the price was not just death. It was the total and absolute annihilation of my soul. And the forest, in its perverse wisdom, was just beginning to collect. Suddenly, the bear moved again. Not towards me, but towards the fallen tree, the one it had knocked down itself, where I had been hiding, eating my jerky. It approached the base of the broken trunk, and with an enormous paw began to dig in the damp earth. It wasn't a frenzy, but methodical, almost ritualistic work. With each scratch, earth flew, revealing exposed roots and dark soil. I watched, confused, terrified, not understanding what it was looking for. Then it stopped. With its muzzle, it nudged something on the ground, something I couldn't distinguish in the gloom. With a slow, deliberate movement, it brought the object to me, pushing it with its nose until it was inches from my face. It was a piece of my jerky, the same I had been eating when the tree collapsed. It was dirty with earth, but unmistakable. The smell of salted, smoked meat, once a comfort, was now a nauseating reminder of my hypocrisy. I had been eating meat while planning to use my aunt as fish bait. The bear looked at me, its eyes fixed on mine, and then, with a slow movement, it pushed the piece of jerky closer, almost touching my lips. There was no growl, no physical threat, but the message was clear, brutal. It was offering me my own food, my own survival, as a mockery. As if to say, "You offered what is weak to the strong, while keeping your own. Now see what remains of your feast." I felt a knot in my throat, not just from fear, but from a deep and overwhelming shame. My cruelty, my cowardice were being exposed in a way that no words could reach. The bear was forcing me to confront the image of myself. I was the predator who became prey, the manipulator who was manipulated by the very nature he tried to dominate. My aunt, still motionless, seemed to watch the scene with a serenity that chilled my blood. Her eyes, if they weren't deceiving me, seemed to gleam with an almost amused light. She was watching me crumble piece by piece. The annihilation of my soul was not just a metaphor, it was an active process, orchestrated by the forest, executed by the bear, and witnessed by my victim. The bear stepped back, but its eyes never left mine. It didn't want me to eat the meat. It wanted me to see it, to understand it, and I understood. The final price was not just the death of the body, but the death of everything I thought I was. The forest was stripping me bare, emptying me, transforming me into nothing, and the night I knew still had much more to collect. The piece of jerky lay there, inches from my cracked lips, dirty with earth, but still recognizable. The smell, once a familiar comfort, was now a poison, a poignant reminder of my hypocrisy. I, the predator, the calculating one, was being forced to confront the symbol of my own pettiness. It was the same meat I had chewed satisfied while planning the vilest of betrayals. The bear needed no words. It had handed me a mirror. I couldn't look away. The jerky was a monument to my cowardice, to my failure to be anything more than a parasite. My throat was dry, not just from thirst, but from a shame so profound it seemed to tear at my chest. The pain in my ribs and wounded arm was a mere whisper compared to the agony of my soul being exposed, flayed, before that ancient creature and my silent aunt. The bear remained there, its eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. There was no hunger in its gaze, no fury. Only a cold assessment, an understanding that seemed to transcend existence itself. It wasn't waiting for me to eat the meat. It was waiting for me to see it, to understand it, and I understood. I was a worm, an insignificant piece of human garbage, and the forest, in its implacable wisdom, was showing me exactly that. My aunt. My eyes, compelled by an invisible force, shifted to her. She was still there, a statue of resilience, her dark silhouette against the gloom of the forest. But this time, there wasn't just the moonlight reflected in her eyes. There was something more, a subtle, almost imperceptible gleam, which I swore was satisfaction. Not a cruel smile, but a stillness that spoke of a delayed justice, of a peace found in my misfortune. She didn't need to move, didn't need to speak. Her mere presence was a condemnation more powerful than any scream. The bear let out a low grunt, a sound that vibrated in my bones, but which was not a threat. It was almost a sigh, a sign that the lesson, for now, had been absorbed. Then, with a slowness that made me hold my breath, it moved away from the piece of jerky. It didn't pick it up, didn't bury it, didn't devour it. It just left it there, a silent testament to my ruin, a constant reminder of my failure. It took a few steps back, moving with the heavy grace of a king in its domain. It didn't move away completely, but positioned itself at a distance where it could observe both me and my aunt. Its eyes, beacons in the darkness, alternated between the two of us, as if comparing, contrasting. I was the stain, the aberration. She, an integral part of the forest, the survivor, the witness. The night's cold intensified, penetrating my torn clothes and broken bones. Every breath was an effort, every heartbeat a drum of despair. I tasted the dried blood on my lips, the smell of earth and bear, and, stronger than anything, the stench of my own moral decay. I was trapped, not just physically, but in a purgatory of my own making. The forest, once a stage for my cruel plans, was now a courtroom. The tall, dark trees were the silent jurors, the howling wind, the prosecutor, and the bear, the patient executioner. I had underestimated nature, underestimated life, underestimated the very essence of existence. I had tried to bend it to my will, and now it was bending me, breaking me, pulverizing me. The night was still young, and the forest, I knew, still held many horrors to reveal, and the bear, my bear, was just the beginning. It was giving me time, time to think, time to suffer, time to understand the final price. And I, the cruel nephew, was beginning to understand that the price was not just death. It was the total and absolute annihilation of my soul, and the forest, in its perverse wisdom, was just beginning to collect. And I was ready to pay, not with life, but with the eternity of my torment. The bear, finally, stood up. There was no haste, just a heavy dignity in its movements. It cast one last look at me, a gaze that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 years of forest, of wild and implacable justice. Then, without a sound, without a growl, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness among the trees. There was no farewell, no final threat, only the void it left behind, a void that was more terrifying than its presence. I was alone, completely alone. The night's cold became unbearable, the pain in my bones excruciating. The jerky lay there, inches away, a constant reminder of my failure. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond. Every muscle seemed to have turned to stone, every nerve into a burning ember. I couldn't scream, couldn't cry. There were no more tears, just a hollow void where my soul used to be. My aunt. I turned my eyes to her one last time. She was still there, motionless, her dark silhouette against the gloom, but her eyes no longer reflected the moonlight. They were closed. A deep sleep, perhaps, or perhaps a peace I would never know. She had survived, she had won, and I lay there, a residue of my own cruelty, left to rot under the indifferent gaze of the forest. The wind howled through the trees, a lament that seemed to echo my own desolation. I was a ghost before dying, an empty shell, condemned to an eternity of regret and torment. The forest had stripped me bare, emptied me, transformed me into nothing. And the night, I knew, still had much more to collect. The bear had left me, but the punishment, the true punishment, was just beginning. I lay there, at the mercy of the elements, of my own mind, and of the incessant memory of my aunt, who now slept in peace. The forest, in its perverse wisdom, had granted me life, only to steal everything that made it bearable. I was the prey and the hunt was over, but the agony would never end.